Hello, welcome to this week's Reflections on the Acts of the Apostles. As you remember from last time, I did not make it all the way through to the end of chapter 19, but we got to about verse 34. And we are at a point in the story where there is a large mob gathered in the stadium there, for like what we would call a stadium. And they're quite annoyed. People are trying to calm them down because this is not a sanctioned gathering, and in order to drown out one of the Jewish men, the crowd is chanting for 2 hours. It says, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," Artemis being the goddess. So I left you there. So we pick up in that chaos still going on. So in starting at verse 35, it tells us that the city clerk quieted down the crowd in verse 35. He's the head of the city executives, the annually elected chief administration. This case, the person being, I guess, kind of like an administrative assistant to the magistrates. So he also serves as the liaison to the Roman authorities, and he definitely does not want the Roman authorities to get involved to put down a riot. So 3 assertions are made by the clerk showing that this assembly is completely unnecessary, and a 4th, that it is positively dangerous to this free city's well-being. The city of Ephesus was allowed to rule itself free of Roman interference up to a point. So his points are: 1, the Ephesians' reputations as guardians of the temple and the image of Artemis is safe. 2, these Christians with their reputations are unsullied. They have neither robbed the temples nor blasphemed our goddess, it says in verse 37. 3, the crowd can have a hearing before the regular courts and the legislatures in verses 38 and 39. And 4, the crowd is in danger of coming under the charge of rioting without a cause, which will involve the Roman authorities and the Roman military. So that's 40 and 41. The clerk declares as undeniable facts the universal reputation of Ephesus as the guardian of the temple and the image which fell from heaven, that is, the image of Artemis, the goddess they worship. There's no extra biblical source of reports or anything that anything fell from heaven at Ephesus, but this clerk may be speaking of the ancient age of the image, which was so old that it was viewed as having been fashioned in the heavens. Such an affirmation speaks to both Demetrius's anxiety and to Paul's teaching about gods made with human hands. So the clerk announces that Artemis's reputation is safe, and she does not fall into the category of idols that Paul is critiquing, because she fell from heaven. She was not made with human hands. So the temple's role as a bank and as a worship center were independent from the other things going on in the city, the magistrates, the Roman rule and stuff. So there really was a fear of robbers in terms of the bank, the temple being a bank where money is kept. And the wealth of the bank enhanced the prestige of the god or goddess. So to commit sacrilege in that language was literally, in the minds of the Ephesians and the worshipers of Artemis, to rob the temple's bank. So the clerk can announce with full authority that the Christians have not robbed the temples. Further, the challenge to polytheism and idolatry have not involved the crimes of public blasphemy, in this case against Artemis. The clerk apparently views the heaven-fashioned image as beyond Paul's teachings. If Paul's approach had been the same as at Athens, Paul's teaching involves a kind of a reasoning, an apology of sorts on the general level of how various gods are worshipped and how Yahweh God is the one true God. So the nature of the deity and the worship is appropriate to it from human beings who are its offspring. So our worship as children of God goes to God. In their culture, they worshipped Artemis and consider themselves to be children of the goddess Artemis. So Paul is not making any direct attack on Artemis. No direct attack is necessary. Paul's tactics have much to teach us about effectively speaking the truth in love to devotees of non-Christian religions. By Paul's own example, we do not malign another person's beliefs. We share the gospel, and we share our own personal belief in Jesus as the Christ, who is the source of our salvation. So in essence, we share our faith story. We don't malign their faith story. The clerk here suggests two legitimate means of remedying the current situation of this mass gathering, which was not sanctioned. Go to the court system. Go to the legislators. The citizens' assembly meeting, that citizen assembly meeting is duly constituted. It's legal for the times where they meet. So the courts could handle private financial disputes, while the citizens' assembly could deal with any alleged attack on the city's prestige or against the temple or Artemis. So the real danger here in verse 40 is for the crowd to be charged with rioting without a cause. They didn't go through the proper channels. In other words, they have gathered without a license, I guess you might say. The city of Ephesus could lose its status as a free city, able to rule itself to a certain degree, if it failed to maintain law and order through its own local authorities. So with this caution, the clerk exercises his authority by dismissing the assembly, and he has the authority to do that. Luke teaches us through this clerk that so long as Christians do not strain the social fabric of the culture through public blasphemy of their gods, fair-minded government officials should protect Christians from any rash, illegal acts of persecutors. Now, this is one way for law-abiding witness to the gospel, which can transform a culture and can advance the gospel without restrictions. Here's where we are stopping. We're chapter 19. So if you haven't already, you may want to pause the video and read or review chapter 20 as we move on in the story. And if you have any questions, comments, I encourage you to leave them in the comment section below the video. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. So verse 20, one of the greatest gifts that a parent, a teacher, a mentor, a coach can give is the gift of encouragement. Luke here is describing Paul's ministry of the gospel, yes, and in with that, encouragement, as he summarizes Paul's movements near the end of this third missionary journey and focuses on a local church gathering in Troas. From Luke's writings, we learn how salvation blessings come in the ministry of mutual encouragement within the church. So when the situation in Ephesus settles down, as we are told in verse 1 of chapter 20, Paul decides it's time to depart. So first, Paul calls the disciples together for some personal encouragement of his students, literally meaning to call the disciples to one side, a little group meeting. The Greek word for encouragement can mean to appeal to them, to exhort them on their next steps, or to comfort them. And it's already just happened that they've gone through a harrowing experience of very nearly being brutally attacked by a mob. So there is some comfort in here, and also appeal to their faith and their commitment, and exhort them on what to do next. For Paul and Luke, exhortation and encouragement is a verbal ministry that is done by the powers of the Holy Spirit and seeks to strengthen Christians to persevere in the faith during their trials, especially during times of physical persecution. There are at least 4 simple things that you can say to a person without making promises that you cannot keep. It is never a good idea, I think, to promise somebody everything is going to be okay. We don't know that. It might not turn out okay. So if you tell somebody, don't worry, everything is going to work out fine, that's not necessarily a good thing. So 4 statements are going to mean more to a hurting person than any platitudes that immediately come to a lot of people's minds, like when you lose a loved one, your loved one is in a better place. That's not comforting to people. I know it sounds like it when you say it, but when a person hears it, what they hear is, no, that person's better place is here with me. Or, everything happens for a reason. Again, I don't support saying that to people. Or, God must have needed another angel. Again, it sounds like a nice platitude, but the person isn't hearing it the way you mean it. And I know the purpose behind saying those kinds of platitudes is to bring comfort. From the perspective of the person who is hurting, these words, they may not bring too much comfort. And there are other ways to say it that are more comforting. You can say things like, I am with you. I am here. I'm listening to you. I care about you. And I'm praying for you. Those are words that can cause hurting people to conclude that God is with them in you. The other platitudes that are less meaningful may cause the hurting person to think God is the reason for their pain and their suffering. I trust none of us mean to suggest God is creating a person's or some people's pain and suffering when someone dies, or when you lose a job, or whatever tragedy or traumatic experience you may be experiencing. So I'm with you. I'm here to listen. I'm not going to leave you. I'll sit with you. I care about you. I will pray for you. Those are some things within your control, and also these kinds of statements that let the person know that they are loved, they are cared for, they are, and you are present with them. And you can bring the presence of Christ with you, even if all you do is sit there and listen. So, going back to Paul, it's maybe a little bit different. They're going to lose Paul. He's leaving them and sending them off to do more mission work. Paul consistently speaks encouragement in the churches, especially when he's about to leave them, and when he visits them after an absence, or when he may not ever be able to visit them again. Then he has been known to send them letters. Those are some of the books of the New Testament, as we call them. So as we move forward from here, we're going to talk a lot about where Paul's going next. So maybe you want to have a map to the area specific to the cities mentioned in this next section of chapter 20. And a good way to find one of those is to say map of Paul's third missionary journey. So as Paul leaves Ephesus in Asia, and in his travels through Macedonia and Achaia in Greece, he's going to head back now to Jerusalem. And it says in verse 3 that Paul speaks many words of encouragement. And we're told that he stayed 3 months in Greece. That's quite a bit of time to be traveling back through ways that he came and encouraging the believers along the way. And knowing the time of year or speculating about the time of year Paul was there, it's probably winter. And that means that sea travel is normally avoided. You don't want to get out in the rough seas in winter of the Mediterranean and shipwreck. Paul's example is an encouragement to us, for it challenges us to be encouragers to others. Paul's example comforts us as well as to know that even though those who brought us to Christ may be absent from us, we can continue to bring others to Christ through the example we were given. And that absence may be for whatever reason. Maybe geographically we're separated by distance, or maybe you may think of someone from your childhood who has transitioned into their eternal home, and you don't get the opportunity to hear their wonderful teachings for you again. So Paul is about to set out on his first leg of the journey to Jerusalem, sailing directly from Achaia to Syria is his plan. Then he becomes aware that some of the Jews who were against him have plotted against him now, and they're quite willing to sacrifice his life to stop his preaching. Paul then changes his plans. He moves back overland, back through Achaia and Macedonia. So this way he avoids possible harm, even death, as perhaps he goes aboard as a passenger. The vessel is crowded with Jewish pilgrims all heading to Jerusalem for Passover, and accidents happen. So Paul divides his party now, and he sends some who happen to be Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus, possibly all of his companions, ahead to Troas by ship. After celebrating the Christian Easter in Philippi, and for a date stamp, Passover during AD 57, about the time we think Paul was doing this particular teaching, was April 7 to 14. So at the end of the winter season, but still maybe a little bit rocky on the waves. The sea trip for his companions is 5 days at sea, journey across what could be against some contrary winds. And Paul and Luke, now with him again, will rejoin the party at Troas. So you may have noted the we language that left off in Philippi, chapter 16, verses 10 through 17, now returns here, chapter 20, verse 5. Suddenly we have the we travel language. Paul uses courage and wise planning so that God's divine purposes were not prevented by external threats and external circumstances, the threats from the Jews who opposed him and the external threatening circumstances of dangers at sea. So it should be with us. We need to use divine guidance, certainly, and courage and wisdom as we share Jesus' message with people around us. And that could be family, it could be friends, it could be neighbors, etc. So now at verse 7 and moving forward. At the end of a week's stay at Troas, Paul continues his ministry of the gospel and encouragement in the context of a worship service. So here we have the earliest clear-cut reference to early church practice concerning Sunday worship. Luke tells us that on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread in verse 7. So here's the we language is back. As a side note, in a letter to Trajan from Bithynia in the early 2nd century, Pliny the Younger describes the Christian practice. He wrote, and he uses they language, so he does not consider himself Christian. They had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verse alternatively among themselves in honor of Christ as to a God. Perhaps in your congregation, as in Redeemer here, we chant the Psalms on Sundays, alternating verses. And then he continues, after this ceremony, it had been their custom to disperse and reassemble later to take food of an ordinary, harmless kind. Although the first day of the week was a work day for the Jewish people, what we now call Christians had consecrated Sundays at its beginning, before dawn, and the end. The before dawn part was because that's when they discovered the empty tomb. And then near the end of the day, they may have worked on Sunday, and then at the end of the day, again, they come back together through corporate worship and celebration of Christ's resurrection. To break bread, as it says in verse 7, in a Christian manner of speaking, points to the fellowship meal begun and completed by the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, which we know of as Holy Communion. Paul's words to the Christians of Troas constitute a formal address, possibly with discussion and with conversation. So Luke emphasizes this speech is length. It extends to midnight, and then after they celebrate the Lord's Supper and the fellowship meal, on until daybreak. Paul knows he's going to be leaving, so he may have given it some extended opportunities. Paul spares no effort in his verbal encouragement and the gospel as he prepares disciples for what he thinks will be life permanently without his presence. He does not have a great understanding that he will be back this way again. So what principles for Christian worship is Luke teaching us through this narrative? The first day of the week is Sunday. The Lord's Day, it is often called, is when Christians consistently gathered for worship, as you heard, before dawn for some chanting of some of the messages of the scriptures, the preaching, the exposition, and the application of the Word of God is an integral part of worship, although I will tell you, my folks especially want to know this, I will not preach all night. I cannot promise to keep everyone awake, though. I do know some folks tend to go to sleep during my sermons. I don't take offense, I just tell them, don't snore and disturb the people around you. The Lord's Supper, the visible Word of God, is just as important as a means of spiritually strengthening the gathered church. Lutherans consider the Lord's Supper, the Holy Communion, to be a means of God's grace, as we call it. Preaching and Holy Communion certainly belong together, and frequently, for the taking of Holy Communion, churches have a variety of ways of doing that. Some churches may have a daily offering of Holy Communion. I'm thinking primarily of Roman Catholic churches. There may be others. Some would take it weekly. I know of some Lutheran churches that have it every Sunday. Some do it every other week. Some do it once a month. Our practice at Redeemer is the first and third Sundays of each month. So that could work out to be every week, but if there's 5 Sundays in a month, then it's only 2, and it throws off that every other week feeling. When some congregations abuse the meals of the church, that is not only Holy Communion, but kind of a fellowship time together, a meal time together. There are at least one example, I guess, and where that was being abused. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul addresses how somehow the fellowship meal has become detached from the sacrament of Holy Communion. And he chastises the people in Corinth because those who have the means and the wealth to be able to have a good meal separate or detach themselves and have their good meal, while they might leave some of the poorer representatives of the congregation to their own ends and means. And Paul is chastising them for that. The fellowship meal should be more like we might call a covered dish dinner or a potluck dinner. We just bring the food together, we share the meal with everybody, irrespective of whether they brought something or they could not afford to bring anything. And Paul's chastisement is that if you start to separate out the fellowship meal from the Holy Communion, you're creating a sense of the family atmosphere being destroyed or lost. So Paul is really telling the Corinthian church, don't do that. We do live in increasingly rootless society, I think. Individuals find themselves often without a meaningful personal face-to-face relationships. I hearken back to my childhood, and I credit some of that to a time when I don't know, I can't point and say this is when it started, but to a time when new houses were being built without front porches. They were being built with lanais in the back, as we call them here in Florida. When I was a child, we didn't have air conditioning. Most of you probably did not if you're of a certain age. So the front porch became a gathering place in the cool of the night. We didn't stay indoors that much until maybe the mosquitoes drove us back in. So you saw other people out on their front porch, people walking. You had community in your neighborhood. Not so much anymore. People are spending time on their back lanais, which are screened in, and you don't really encounter many other people that way. And another way in which we kind of are being rootless, social media. So things like Facebook, Twitter, Skype, FaceTime, whatever you happen to use. There's all kinds of social media out there. And in a positive way, it gives us a way to communicate across vast geographical distances, and we can do that in real time. I know people in Sweden, I know people in Brazil, I know people in Denmark, and I can communicate with them through Facebook or through other ways of Snapchat or something like that. So those same electronic programs can isolate us even further, though. I don't leave the house to be able to communicate with those people. And you can probably just Google search and find pictures of entire families sitting in the same room together, although each person is on their own electronic device. So you may have 5 people sitting together in a circle of chairs and couches, and they're all looking down like this. So in a way, when we gather on Sunday mornings for worship, and when we especially gather around the Lord's table, we have kind of a saving grace for those personal relationships. We recapture that sense of family within our congregations. We are doing live stream now for the sake of those people who cannot come on Sunday morning. And at the same time, I encourage anyone who is able to come not to simply sit home and watch us on the TV or your electronic device, but come and join us, especially on those first and third Sundays when we have Holy Communion, and we recapture grace found in those personal relationships. And it may be that Luke is writing about this stuff. I did have a reason for telling you this, because urban Rome, Theophilus and his colleagues, may have found all of this as an inviting picture, coming together as community for worship, fellowship, meal, and Holy Communion. So into the middle of Paul's long gospel message and his encouragement comes a tragedy. We have Eutychus, which actually translates into good fortune, which is kind of ironic. Probably a boy between 7 and 14 years old. He falls into a deep sleep. The room in which they're meeting, the atmosphere has probably been heavy. They're using torches maybe, or some kind of smoking oil candles called lampas, and the boy probably tried to catch a little fresh air by sitting in the windowsill. There's a lateness of an hour, a hypnotic kind of effect of the flickering lights, Paul's lengthy preaching. All of this probably contributed to his drowsiness. If he's only 7 or maybe even early teens, he loses his balance. He falls asleep. He falls out of the window. And verse 9 says he was picked up dead. And Luke tells us what we all know: death is an unwelcome intruder that suddenly leaves those who witness it speechless and immobile. Paul's actions and words bring comfort. Not unlike Elisha of old, Paul threw himself, or better, fell on the young man and put his arms around him, according to verse 10. The boy's life returns as Paul calls out, "Don't be alarmed," or literally he would have said, "Stop being distressed. He is alive. His life, his psyche, his soul, whatever we call it, is in him." Then, almost matter-of-factly, Luke tells us Paul returns to the upper room, shares in the Lord's Supper and the fellowship meal, then continues his gospel preaching and encouragement through personal conversation until daylight. And then Luke's message simply says, Paul left, and I'm going to leave you there, because that seems like a good news story. So thank you for joining me here again this week as we continue in our overview of the Acts of the Apostles. If you happen to be in the Sun City Center area, join us on Sunday morning for 10 a.m. worship. If you're not in the area, you can't get here geographically, join us on live stream. We welcome you as well. Take care. God bless.